Hello and welcome, guys. We are going to do a Lord of the Rings set review. However, the catch is we're only looking at just the good cards. I've tried to condense it down as much as possible to the cards that will be relevant for those of you who play Modern. That's the format that I primarily play. So, without further ado, let's jump straight into it. So, firstly, let's talk about cards that I think will actually see play. The first of which being Delighted Halfling, a 1-mana 1/2 mana dork, taps for colorless, or it taps for a mana of any color that lets you cast a legendary spell that can't be countered. And one of the reasons why I think this card is going to be so impactful is the presence of cards like Wrenn and Six, Lava Dart, and like damage splitting effects like Fury and Fire and Ice. These cards have been really harsh on mana dorks in Modern, particularly things like Birds of Paradise and the Hierarchs, Ignoble and Noble Hierarch both. They all have 1 toughness, and that makes them very susceptible to things like just a turn 2 Wrenn and Six pinging them down for absolutely 0 lost value for your opponent, other than, I suppose, a loyalty counter on Wrenn and Six. It also means that Fury can come down very easily and wipe up, 2 mana dorks and another 2 toughness creature. And having your mana dorks die so easily to these types of effects is very unfortunate in the decks that want to play mana dorks. And Delighted Halfling not only is a mana dork that survives those effects, it also has a point of attack, meaning that it can trade with a Ragavan instead of just not being able to block. And then the fact that it taps for an uncounterable color for a legendary spell, which could be a planeswalker, by the way, because it's not a legendary creature, it's a legendary spell. So making uncounterable legendary artifacts or planeswalkers or creatures and mana fixing in that regard is very nice. I think that Delighted Halfling will definitely see play. The next card on the list is Flame of Anor. This is a Izzet 3-mana instant that allows you to choose one, target player draws 2 cards, destroy target artifact, or deal 5 damage to target creature, and if you happen to control a wizard, you may choose 2 instead. This immediately should be familiar in the form of previous cards that do see play in Modern, such as Archmage's Charm and Prismari Command. Powerful moto spells, especially 3-mana ones that let you draw 2 cards, or in the case of Prismari, draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. That mode by itself means that this type of card is never going to be a dead card in hand. You always will be able to just cast it to draw 2 cards and get a little ahead on card advantage, which is what a lot of these control and topo decks are looking to do, is make sure they're staying ahead on board, ahead on cards. However, it also has a couple of relevant modes, one being to be able to interact with the board and kill a creature, because obviously if you're spending 3 mana to spin your wheels and draw more cards, but not actually interacting with what's going on the battlefield, you might just fall behind and lose. So being able to kill a creature, and up to 5 damage is not a small amount either, killing things like Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, for example, just 1 short of Unholy Heat. A very good removal effect here, and then having the extra, kind of tech mode of destroying an artifact does definitely come up and is relevant, especially when you see cards like Prismari Command that have the ability to snipe an artifact and maybe shoot for 2 damage. This type of thing does come up. And the fact that you can, on occasion, get 2 modes instead of 1 on Flame of Anor makes it, I think, a very strong contender. So I think that this card will definitely see some play. Next, we have the card Forge Anew. 3-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, return an equipment from your graveyard to the battlefield. As long as it's your turn, you can equip at instant speed, and instead of actually paying the equipability, you can pay 0 for the first equip cost during your turn. So not only is this going to let you equip for 0 and equip at instant speed, it also will, when it comes into play, reanimate an equipment from your graveyard to the battlefield. I think that this is going to be particularly good in the Modern Hammer decks, where you have this 1-mana equipment that is able to pack a huge punch with +10/+10, but the equip cost is very steep. Obviously, Hammer decks are trying to cheat around their equip costs, and Forge Anew is yet another way to do that. And in fact, the Forge Anew will bring back a Colossus Hammer that's been discarded or otherwise destroyed, perhaps from Forge Anew, the card that we discussed before. And then the fact that this also just has synergy with other big, dumb artifacts, like, for example, if you put a Caldera into play and they Prismatic Ending the token, you can use Forge Anew to 0 equip Caldera to something else, which seems very useful. But just in general, this being another way to free equip Colossus Hammer, I think is going to be very good, so I do expect to see some of this card moving forward. Next on the list is Morya Marauder. It's a 2-mana double strike 1/1 goblin that says whenever a goblin or orc deals damage to a player, exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card this turn. Personally, I think that this card has the potential to be very powerful, but it also has some pretty strict downsides. First of all, it's asking for you to be ahead on board so that you can actually get damage through. And secondly, a 1/1 double strike, at least it survives some small chump blocks from random tokens, but the truth is, a lot of the time, your 1/1 double strike is still going to get roadblocked by, say, a Tarmogoyf or a 3/3 Dragon's Rage Channeler or whatever. So I do think that on curve, this is not really up to snuff, but the sneaky use of this card comes into play when you're able to vial it in or flash it in otherwise into play after your opponent's declared blocks to make their previously profitable blocks now no longer profitable and be able to get an extra card. I personally find this one as more of a question mark, but any kind of goblins card that has a relevant effect, especially a blanket effect that hits all of your goblins in play, definitely deserves a mention in my opinion. Next, we have the card Peregrine Took, a 3-mana 2/3 that lets you make extra food tokens whenever you would make any token, and it also allows you to sacrifice 3 foods to draw a card. In particular, I've heard Aspiring Spike talking about this card in reference to the very go wide, like make a lot of token strategies, especially the decks that play Underworld Cookbook and are trying to spew out a bunch of foods, maybe use Azmarana, Marika Dice, and a Kuldakar. But also, you know, this card does share some similarity to a card I've seen Aspiring Spike play in the past called Academy Manufacturer, which has a similar effect. It makes a bunch of extra tokens, but the difference between Peregrine Took and a card like Academy Manufacturer is not only does it give you the additional tokens, but it also gives you the outlet for those tokens, allowing you to draw cards if you are able to make a bunch of foods and progressing your game plan that way. And so I'm no expert in this style of deck, but when a creator like Aspiring Spike points out a card as being relevant for an archetype that he created, I think we should take notice, and so I'm including Peregrine Took on the list. We also have the card Reprieve, which is very similar to a card that we've had in Modern for a very long time, Remand, and basically what this does is it's going to bounce a spell back to its owner's hand and draw a card. Of course, this is only going to affect things that are being cast in the moment, not things that have already dissolved. However, there's a little upside to Reprieve over Remand, which is that even if the spell is uncounterable, Reprieve will still return that spell. So, like, say your opponent slams a Primeval Titan with Cavernous Souls, and it can't be countered, you can still reprieve that Primeval Titan back to their hand and draw your card, whereas Remand would just cycle to draw a card, but it wouldn't actually return the spell to hand. So, in that sense, Reprieve is technically a little better than Remand. That said, there aren't very many decks that are interested in playing Remand these days, especially with how efficient Modern has gotten and how many 1 and 0 mana spells there are that you just don't really want to Remand. We've never really had an effect like this in White. White counterspells are definitely new territory, and for that reason, obviously Reprieve, I think, deserves to get the nod. Anytime we get a new effect like this that has previously shown to be Modern playable, it's definitely worth noting, so I think Reprieve makes the list. We also have the card Samwise Gamgee, a 2-mana 2/2 that says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, make a food, and then you can sacrifice 3 foods to return a historic card from your graveyard to your hand. And the reason this card is on the list is because it's part of a 3-card combo involving Cauldron Familiar and then any sacrifice outlet. I've chosen Viserys here as it fits with the creature combo strategy, but of course the idea here is to put Cauldron Familiar into play, make a food token, sacrifice the Familiar to Viserys here, and then sacrifice the food that you made to bring the Cauldron Familiar back, make another food, sacrifice it to Viserys here, bring the Cauldron Familiar back by sacrificing the food, and every time you loop this, your opponent's losing 1 and you gain 1. So this is an infinite combo that lets you win the game on the spot. I think for that reason, Samwise deserves a mention. I do believe you'll see some of this deck in the Modern format. Whether it becomes a top contender, I am kind of doubtful, but it is nice that Samwise also happens to fit well with the card Azmarana, Marika Dice, and a Kuldakar, or Asmore for short, as I'm going to call it for the rest of this video if it does get mentioned again. The fact that Samwise and Asmore are in color for the other cards in this combo, and the fact that Finale of Devastation, a card that is often used to facilitate Asmore, is able to also get your 1-drops like Cauldron Familiar and Viscera very easily, is very nice synergy. So I think that we'll definitely see a bit of Samwise in the future. And then we have, of course, the flagship card of the set, so to speak, the One Ring. 4 mana indestructible that gets protection from everything until your next turn when you cast it. I was going to say when it comes into play, but that's not quite correct. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you'll lose 1 life for each burn counter on it. And of course, you can tap it to put a burn counter on it and then draw a card for each counter that is on it. So you play it for 4, your opponent can't interact with it in any way. You are able to tap it immediately, draw a card, and then on your next upkeep, you'll lose a life, tap it immediately, and draw 2 more cards, and then from that point on, it just goes exponential. Of course, you're going to end up losing a lot of life from the burden counters, but if you have ways to either gain life or remove those counters and move them on to something else, for example, with Power Conduit, a card that is seeing play in some of the Dice Factory-style decks with like Astral Cornucopia, ways to utilize those counters and remove them from the One Ring, or ways to just consistently gain life, or just ways to kill your opponent before the life loss actually matters, I think that the One Ring has the potential to be very broken. My personal opinion is that this card is only really going to see play in artifact combo decks, but in decks that would otherwise try to play a lot of broken artifacts and try to lock their opponent out or try to make use of the synergy with the counters, I think that the One Ring will definitely see play, so definitely be on the lookout for that one. And that is all the cards I think are guaranteed to see play. That said, there are a few cards on my list that I think have the potential to see play, and the first of which is Frodo, Determined Hero, 2-mana 2/2 that lets you attach an equipment with a value of 2 or less to Frodo when it enters the battlefield or attacks. And then, as long as it's your turn, all damage that would be dealt to Frodo is prevented. So, of course, the first card that comes to mind when looking at a card like this is Colossus Hammer. Being able to cheat through the equip cost and the fact that it's on Enter the Battlefield or Attack, I think makes this very useful for hammer decks, but also the fact that you can use Frodo to equip during your turn the Colossus Hammer, and then if your opponent is going to try to Unholy Heat or Bolt in response, the fact that Frodo will prevent that damage from going through and making the damage-based removal ineffective in that sense, I think is extremely valuable. In the past, there's a card called Core Outfitter that is double white for a 2/2 that just equips something when it comes into play, but doesn't have the attack ability, doesn't have the prevent damage ability, but it does let you equip to a creature other than the Core Outfitter. I probably should have put a picture on the screen. Maybe I'll put it, in the edits, but I think that this card is definitely better than Core Outfitter in the hammer decks. That said, not many decks are necessarily playing Core Outfitter, so it remains to be seen whether Frodo will be particularly useful in the hammer decks or not. I would be surprised if it didn't see play, but it definitely deserves a mention. Next, we have the card Minas Tirith, the legendary land that enters tapped unless you control a legendary creature, and of course it does tap for a white, but the interesting part of this card is that you can pay 2 mana and draw a card using Minas Tirith, but only if you've attacked with 2 or more creatures. So the biggest downside, I think, to this card is the fact that it enters tapped, and in a deck that's trying to attack with multiple creatures or a big board every turn, having a land that enters tapped is actually a huge downside. So unless you were to play like a turn 1 legendary creature like Kithian, or there's I think it's Isamaru, there's like a legendary 2/1 hound creature, those cards will enable you to have Minas Tirith enter untapped, but they're not particularly good on their own. And on the other hand, if you're attacking with 2 or more creatures every turn, then paying 2 to draw a card seems kind of win more in those scenarios. But still, it's a very powerful effect. Definitely the most powerful of this cycle of lands from the set, in my opinion. And so I decided to give it the mention here. Next, we have a card that I think could see play in some of the blue-white taxes lists that occasionally pop up. It's a 2-mana 2/2, Vigilance, and a Ward 1, so it's difficult for your opponent to interact with. And you can tap it to give another creature you control protection from a card type of your choice. So, for example, if they're trying to kill it with an instant or sorcery, you can give it protection from instant or sorcery. If you're trying to attack through your opponent's creatures, you can give a creature protection from creatures, and then they won't be able to block. Enchantments, there's a lot of possibilities with that ability. It's kind of like a Mother of Runes ability. And like I mentioned, I think that this could fit very easily into a blue-white taxes strategy. We've seen a number of cards like Spellqueller, Lavinia, Meddling Mage, Reflector Mage over the years that seem to slot very well into a blue-white taxes strategy, and just having another card to add on top of the already becoming long list of cards that make splashing blue appealing in a taxes list, I think is very cool for the format. I would be surprised if this card saw no play, but I also don't think that's necessarily guaranteed to see play. Anyways, regardless, it is a card that I'm very excited about, so it makes the list. Then we have Samwise the Stouthearted, a 2-mana 2/1 that has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, you can choose a permanent in your graveyard that was put there this turn and return it to your hand, and then the ring tempts you. And we'll talk a little bit about the ring and the temptation effect later on in the PowerPoint, but for now, I think that this card is just on the surface level playable from the fact that you can use it to fetch, flash in Sam, and get your fetch back, just to immediately have that sort of Eternal Witness type effect. You can evoke a Solitude and sacrifice the Solitude to the evoke trigger, and then get the Solitude back with your Sam ETB ability. So the synergies here with things that have left the battlefield this turn is really not hard to trigger that and put something into the graveyard during that turn. And on the surface, it's just a 2/1 flash that gains you an extra card, which I think is extremely valuable. So I would be surprised if this did not see play. But maybe it's just barely not powerful enough to make an impact on the format, so we'll see. Speaking of maybe just barely not powerful enough, another card that makes the list is Sauron'S Ransom. 3 mana for a blue-black instant that says choose an opponent. They look at the top 4 cards of your library and separate them into a face-down pile and a face-up pile, and then you get to choose which pile you want to put in your hand, and the other pile goes to the graveyard, and then the ring tempts you. So again, this is another kind of effect that I think has some potential with the ring tempts you just being kind of stapled onto it. And of course, it's very reminiscent of the card Fact or Fiction, which is a card that has actually seen play in Modern since it was printed in the Modern Horizons set, but is kind of fallen out of favor now, as 4 mana for this type of effect is kind of a lot, whereas 3 mana is a little more doable. Of course, the biggest thing that is going for this card, or the biggest thing that this card has going, is the fact that regardless of how your opponent makes the piles, the person who ends up choosing what cards you put into your hand is you. And that is a huge, huge difference. If your opponent chose the cards that go to your hand, that means you're always getting what the opponent thinks is going to be better for them, whereas if you choose the cards, your opponent might have separated the piles incorrectly because they don't have all the information, or there might just be a specific card that you're digging for, and no matter what it is that's in the pile, if you hit this card, you're going to take that card. In that instance, Sauron'S Ransom is infinitely better than if your opponent always got to make the choice for you. For example, you can't cast Sauron'S Ransom digging for a Supreme Verdict or Damnation because your opponent would always choose to put the Damnation in the graveyard and or give you a pile that doesn't have a face-up Damnation, for example. So that is something that is extremely exciting about the card. However, at 3 mana, for an instant that probably on average is drawing you 2 cards, and you don't necessarily know what the best of the 2 choices is, definitely is debatable. I think it has the potential to see play, but history has, kind of said that these types of effects are not usually good enough, so time will tell. Definitely an interesting card, though. We also have the card Stone of Eric. It's a 1-mana legendary artifact that says if a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead, and then for 2 mana, you can sacrifice the stone and exile target player's graveyard and draw a card. Very reminiscent of other kind of graveyard hate pieces like Grafdigger's Cage with that static ability, and Relic of Progenitus, where you can pay 1, exile it, draw a card, and exile all graveyards. This exiles target player's graveyard, which means that you can still play your own graveyard synergies when you're playing Stone of Eric, or Erech, I don't know how to pronounce that, by the way. But it also has a static ability, meaning that even if it just sits in play, it will still have an impact. It's extremely interesting that this is a 1-mana artifact, because it means you can tutor it up with Urza's Saga, making it a good sideboard card to bring in matchups where you want to have an effect like this. You can pop your Saga off on turn 3 and get Stone of Eric in play, and then it'll just sit there and do its thing. And then later on, you can always just sacrifice it in order to cycle and get a one-shot effect. And in particular, this is good against the cards Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, because their Undying creatures will just get exiled if they sacrifice them, and the Undying Malice Evoke creature combo that you sometimes see with things like Solitude, Grief, and Fury. Instead of being able to bring their creature back, as long as Stone is in play, their creature will just get exiled when it goes to the graveyard instead of triggering Undying. So it's hate for these style of strategies, and in other matchups, you can bring it in just to have a way to hate on an opponent's graveyard and be able to get an extra card out of it instead of just exiling their graveyard as a one-shot and not get anything else. The fact that it draws a card can be relevant in certain decks. So I think this is definitely a very interesting card, especially for a sideboard consideration or a Saga target. And then finally, we've gotten to a couple of honorable mentions, cards that I think are interesting or cool, but maybe not quite there. Alright guys, I had to take a break, but I'm back for the honorable mentions. First of which is Call of the Ring and Ranger's Firebrand. Both of these are cards that are very strongly reliant on the effect of the ring tempting you. I did manage to play a pre-release just the other night, and I got to play a little bit with the ring tempting you as a mechanic. And though it does provide some value, I find it unlikely that just being able to use the ring, I don't think it's going to be as oppressive an ability as it is in something like Legacy with the Monarch abilities, or the more recent one from the D&D set, I forget what it's called, the Initiative. Those are, lasting effects that are always useful, and, adding that ability onto an otherwise underwhelming card can make those cards very good. However, the ring tempting you, which if you're not familiar, this is the way that ability works. First of all, the first time that you are tempted by the ring, you get the first ability on a ring bearer of your choice. And then every subsequent time that the ring tempts you, you can choose to shift the ring bearer to a different creature, and you add the next ability in line. So the first time you get the ability for your ring bearer not to be blocked by creatures with greater power. The second time you get the attack, draw, and then discard. The third time, whenever an opponent does block your ring bearer, then that creature has to be sacrificed at the end of combat. And then the last one being that your opponent will lose 3 life whenever the ring bearer does combat damage to a player. And I didn't find this ability to be oppressive enough to make it necessarily worth playing cards specifically in order to get the ring to tempt you, but if that proves to be not the case in actual modern gameplay, and if it seems to be reasonable to play cards like Ranger's Firebrand simply because the ring tempts you and gives you an advantage that your opponent otherwise does not have for the entire game unless they're also playing cards that have the ring tempting you, I think that these cards are probably unlikely to have an impact. Of course, Call of the Ring being a little different, basically, since you can pay 2 life and draw a card every time you change your ring bearer. So as long as you have either no creatures in play that are the ring bearer, or 1 creature to switch the ring to every time this triggers on your upkeep, then of course you're going to be able to keep paying 2 life and drawing a card. So Call of the Ring I found to be quite interesting. But time will tell whether this ability is useful or not for the modern format. Another card that I have on this list is Boromir, Warden of the Tower. It's a 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance with a static ability. If an opponent casts a spell and no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. So obviously we're looking at things like Living End, Crashing Footfalls, Restore Balance type cascade spells, as well as pitch elementals, as I like to call them, evokers, such as Fury, Solitude, Subtlety, these types of effects. Boromir, Warden of the Tower, allowing you to prevent these things from being cast just on an already on stats, 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance creature. It's already very good, but then it has the additional ability to sacrifice to give your team indestructible until end of turn, and then again we have the ring tempts you as kind of an added line of text there on an otherwise ordinary ability. I think that this card has the potential definitely to see play. I think maybe possibly sideboard play. I know some have been speaking about using Boromir in the main board as a way to just have a kind of efficient hate bear that is also a good beater against the decks like Living End and the Fury decks, that also allows you some, insurance against like Supreme Verdict type effects or Damnation. I don't necessarily see this card seeing main board play, but again, time will tell. I think that this is definitely a card that's worth consideration. Maybe a sideboard card, maybe a main board card, maybe not a card at all. We'll see. But definitely an interesting one nonetheless. Another card that I have found to be quite interesting from the set is Council's Deliberation. 2-mana instant, draw a card. Whenever you scry, if you control an island, you can exile this from your graveyard and then draw a card. And of course, the first type of thing that comes to mind is very incidental scry effects like Opt, where you can scry 1 and draw a card, or like the enter the battlefield tapped temples that let you scry. If you just happen to mill over or have cast a couple of Council's Deliberations, this is essentially 2-mana, draw 2 cards. But the problem with this, and the reason why I didn't include it higher on the list, is because there's really not a whole lot of incidental scrying that happens in Modern. The tap lands that I mentioned before, the temples, are not playable because having your land enter tapped is a huge detriment. Even in the control decks, it can sometimes be very annoying, hence why we see cards like Hall of the Storm Giants being played, since it has the ability to enter untapped, at least early. And other than something like Opt, I can't really think of any cheap, efficient scry effects either. So I think that this card has the potential to be very powerful. I've played a decent amount of the card Think Twice in Modern, back when I used to play Blue Eye Control, and if you have known me since then you're a real one. And I always liked Think Twice, but being able to get the flashback, so to speak, of Think Twice for free, so to speak, just by casting an Opt or something, or otherwise playing normal cards that just happen to scry, I think that could be quite powerful. And I haven't seen a lot of people talking about this card, but the truth is, how many scry effects are there really in Modern? I can think of cards like Opt or like Condescend that scry and are relatively playable, but there's not a whole lot. If you can think of more, let me know in the comments below, especially if you want to put together a deck list playing this card and utilizing the scry to draw a card ability. I think it could be quite good, but for now it's on the potential contenders. Another card that I think has some potential but doesn't necessarily fit quite exactly for Modern is Orcish Bowmasters. As a 2-mana 1/1, this is a flash creature that says when it enters the battlefield, or when your opponent draws cards past the first one in each of their draw steps, it'll deal 1 damage to any target and then amass 1, which for most intents and purposes is going to make a 1/1 token. But every time you amass with an orc already in play or an army already in play, it just adds a counter to the one that's already in play. So the first time this triggers, it makes a 1/1. Second time, it'll grow that 1/1 into a 2/2 using plus counters, and so on and so forth. However, one notable lack in Modern, is compared to a format like Legacy, is the card Brainstorm, which is extremely prevalent in older formats. Additionally, there are cards like Ponder. There's a lot of additional cards like Preordain, in older formats that are not modern that actually draw additional cards, but in modern we don't really see a whole lot of this type of effect, and potentially Orcish Bowmasters could be very good against Brainstorm, making a threat and pinging, but in Modern, I don't see how often you're really triggering this creature. I mean, it is also just a flash, 2-mana 1/1 that makes another 1/1 and has some additional value potentially, but I just don't really see it fitting in Modern, so I've put it in the in this section. Another card that I think has interesting potential, but maybe is not quite there, is Press the Enemy. 4-mana instant, return target spell or non-land permanent to its owner's hand. It has to be an opponent's permanent, I guess I should mention, or spell. And then it says you may cast an instant or sorcery with equal or lesser value from your hand without paying its mana cost. Of course, we've talked about these cards a couple times throughout the duration of this presentation, but we're thinking about casting things like Living End or Restore Balance just from your hand. Of course, you can also cast something like Crashing Footfalls out of Rhinos, but that deck is more likely to just suspend Rhinos and move on and not just keep it in hand, whereas these two cards are not particularly good on suspend, so I think that this is much better for a Living End or Restore Balance type strategy, because obviously you can just cast it at instant speed with your Oppressed Enemy while interacting with your opponent, which seems very powerful in my opinion. However, the downside being this card is a 4-mana instant, and 4 mana is not easy to attain in Modern. Perhaps if you were to make a brew that also used something like Search for Tomorrow to try to press the enemy on turn 3 or something, and still be able to cascade into your Living End or Restore Balance, then maybe there's some potential there, but it's definitely very iffy. So I don't know how much I expect the Cascade decks to actually adopt this card, but it is definitely a very powerful option for those decks. I just don't know how good this card will be in those decks, hence it deserves a spot in the honorable mentions section. And then we come to the last section of cards, which I've lovingly denoted, this card is a trap, and that's because I don't think these cards are actually good, and I've seen other people really hype up these cards or hope that these cards will have a lot of potential. And the first one is Elven Farsight, which some have denoted the Green Ponder, which I think this card is very far from. So 1-mana sorcery, scry 3, then reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature, draw a card. And of course, you see the problem pretty much instantaneously when you evaluate this card, which is this is a sorcery. You're also going to need to have lands in your deck. But in order to get value off this card, you have to have a density of creatures that you can scry to the top in order to even get your card draw off of it. And the fact that you have to leave a creature on top also means that you're usually looking at one less card on the scry. If one of them is a creature, you're probably going to leave it on top. So it's really like scry 2 and, cycle into the creature that is in the top 3 cards, which is like, I don't know how to feel about it. I think that like a deck like Elves is the type of deck that could really make use of this effect. But then again, I also don't think that a deck like Elves needs Green Ponder. Like they'd rather just play more creatures or more powerful payoffs. Like having a bunch of this sorcery in their deck doesn't really help them in any meaningful way, I don't think. So I do think this card is a trap. And then the card Stern Scolding, some have mentioned that they think this card will be playable in Modern or actively good in Modern, and I just have to disagree. And here's a couple of the reasons why. There are cards like Wrenn 6, Amulet of Vigor, Hardened Scales. There are a number of non-creature cards that are must counters, or the type of thing that you would want to be able to hit with your cheap counter magic like Stern Scolding that just they're not touchable by this card. And though it is possible for Stern Scolding to trade up on mana against cards like Yawgmoth, the reality is Modern has some creatures that you would want to counter with Stern Scolding, but it has many non-creature threats that you do need to counter, and this will not hit any of them. And for that reason, I think it's just too narrow. It's also worth noting this card suffers the problem of being on the draw, where if your opponent leads on a 1-drop that you need to interact with, and then you just untap, play your land, and hold up Stern Scolding, they're already ahead. Like, if you're playing a Ragavan Mirror, and your opponent goes turn 1 Ragavan, and you're sitting there with a Stern Scolding, it's like, oops. So I think that this card is definitely a trap. I would be very surprised if this sees play. In fact, I've seen some people say this card is better than the card Minor Misstep, and I just wholeheartedly disagree, because at least Minor Misstep hits some of these other non-creature threats that I think are important. I don't know. That's just my opinion. Let me know if you disagree in the comments below. And speaking of the comments below, let me know what you thought about this presentation. If I have not already touched on a card that you would have expected me to talk about, then it probably means that I don't think it's particularly notable. It is possible I've missed something, so if there's a card that you think is particularly notable and I didn't discuss it, then please feel free to leave it in the comments below. I'm open to any and all discussion, and I'd love to be proven wrong about other cards in the set. But beyond that, if you enjoy this type of content, or if you just want to let me know that you support my channel and what it is that I do, then leave a like, comment, share the video. anything you can to help me boost the channel up a bit. I'm very, very close to 1,000 subscribers, and I'm working on a remake of the intro to Amulet Titan PowerPoint video that I did a long time ago. I've gotten a little more confident on camera, and so I hopefully am not stuttering as much, and I know how to edit some of the dead space out of it and try to really cut it down to what the people really need to know about Amulet. So I'm excited to redo that video, and if you want to see that, then help me get up to 1,000 subscribers, because that's the next milestone, and it's not that far away. And yeah, thank you again to everyone who's already supporting me, and hopefully you learned something from this video. Let me know if I missed anything, and I will see you guys in the next one. This is Red-Faced Menace, signing off.